Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly seminar. We are really delighted to have Wendy Wong speaking today. Wendy, of course, is one of our research leads at the Institute. She's also a professor of political science here. And her work has been supported by Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and she is focusing on the crossroads of international relations and comparative politics. Current projects focus on human rights in the digital age of datafication, functional governance, and NGO data concerning the global register of nonprofit data sources. Wendy is working on a book. I think we're getting a little preview of the book research. So a great which I've chatted with her about. It's really fascinating and a great opportunity to help shape those ideas. So we will just let you take it away, Wendy. Thanks.
Sounds good. Okay. Thank you, Jillian. All right. I'm really excited to present today. As Jillian said, this is part of an ongoing book project that the SRI has been very supportive of. And I'd like to thank my fellow research leads and the general SRI community for all the input I've gotten thus far on this project. I also want to give a shout out to my interdisciplinary super team of RAs for supporting the growth of this idea. So Alex Logue, Julian Posada, Sarah Ryu, Daphne Dror-Shaplansky, and Jamie Duncan. I've learned a lot from all of you, and I'm really hoping to get a lot of good feedback on this project. So the book is called Datafied, Rebooting Human Rights in the Digital Age, and it's written for and intended for a general audience. And so it's conceptual and it's exploratory. But that being said, there are a lot of concepts that touch on multiple academic fields, and I'm happy to engage more in those in Q&A. And I'm drawing on lots of fields outside of my own, which is political science. So before I start, I just want to make a clarification that when I say the word data today, what I mean is digital data, data that can be stored in computers, and that is about or from people. And so unless I say otherwise, that's really what I'm referring to. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a slide of something. I think most of us are probably familiar with this. I'm sure many of us have sent or received at least one text message today, and many of us have iPhones. So, this is kind of the standard text message format. And we may even have text that kind of look like this. This exchange is a little bit loaded. I think, though, it's standard stuff if you have a lot of experience texting with teenagers or maybe even someone in their 20s, thinking about the nature of life. I'd venture, though, that very few of us have actually exchanged text with a dead person. And that's because Roman was actually dead during this exchange. So I'll tell you a little bit more about Roman. He was a young tech entrepreneur who was hit by a car and died in November of 2015. And as a way of coping with her grief, Roman's friend and fellow tech entrepreneur, Eugenia Koida, leveraged some of the technology she was using for her own startup and made a chatbot based on 8,000 of Roman's texts that she collected from various family and friends when he died. And so she made this bot. The reception has been mixed in terms of thinking about the implications of the bot, but most people agree that actually it does sound a lot like Roman. And so it's successful in that way. Now, for me, Roman's chatbot raises many questions, and there are three I'm going to hopefully be addressing today in the talk with you. So the first is that I want to make the point that digital data are a part of us. It's not just what we create, but it actually can be thought of as you. And I think this is a really important distinction to make, because it means the human experience has fundamentally been altered from the analog world or what we knew before, given the prevalence of data in our lives. And this raises the third question, which is who has control? And I would argue, indeed, autonomy over data about you. And so this is not an audience I really need to be belaboring this point, but nonetheless, I do want to say that data have become very central in our lives. The ubiquity of data are becoming very difficult to ignore. So there are some obvious ways, such as social media or email or online searches. Our own smart devices are creating lots of data from us and about us, but also non-obvious ways, in the ways that data are being collected on our devices via apps and cookies on websites, in credit scores, and in thinking about how our devices at home even are collecting data about us in order to work better. And of course, we also have all these different loyalty programs that have been around for a long time. So as I said, the datafication of our lives is a fundamental shift in the world from the way that we have lived as human beings previously. And so what I want to convince you of today is that these data, in fact, are you. They aren't digital trails, they aren't digital dust or digital detritus or any of these other terms we've used to talk about data as being a byproduct. In fact, they are you. And so they reveal who you are. They are you as your thoughts and your search bar, your search history. They are you in the sense that the number of steps you took and your heart rate when you were doing exercise. And they are as you as your body is, just in a different form, or what we might say substrate. So if the digital is reality, the digital also poses some problems for us in the way we've conceived our world, in that there is no opt-out function for our digital reality. So the data being gathered are what I call in the book, the data you, which I distinguish from the physical you. And the point here is, while we have a lot of rules about how physical you should be protected by human rights, we don't have that same kind of we don't have those same kind of protections for the data you. And the data you is arguing with the world as much as, if actually not more than, the physical you during something like the global pandemic we're all experiencing now. So you may be asking, well, that's all well and good, but what does this have to do with human rights? So I think human rights are relevant because they are the only, or one of the most prominent, globally legitimate set of institutions that we have created to protect ideas around human dignity and human autonomy. And they are largely today about regulating state behavior. Now, what datafication does is it effectively curtails some aspect of human autonomy by gathering data on people and using that to predict where we land. It uses, and data are increasingly being analyzed by algorithms to determine what we see online, what we have access to or don't have access to, whether we're giving job opportunities or credit or otherwise. And a lot of these activities are not state-driven. So this is really where human rights can be both useful and yet are not currently properly situated for our world of datafication. Another question you might be asking is, well, how is what we face through datafication different from other situations where people don't have control over artifacts they produced while they were alive? So as academics, for example, we send out our ideas in the world in the form of publications and lectures. So we're out there sending pieces of ourselves all the time and creating artifacts of ourselves all the time. The big difference is between your papers and data about you is that your papers aren't the sum total of who you are. And depending on who that person might be, it might be a substantial part of who you are, but it's not entirely you. I think by contrast, I'd be willing to bet that the data you produce through your interaction with digital devices actually comes much closer to being the sum total of who you are. So your notes, your appointments, your feelings, your fears, your mood, and your physical activities, and among other things. So data you is a manifestation of you in data, which increasingly shapes the options that are available to physical you. So in a world of datafication, we both need human rights to help preserve autonomy and human dignity, as they always have done. But human rights are woefully outdated at the same time. So they don't think about humans as data, and they need to. And I just want to say that thinking about humans as data doesn't dehumanize us. I think the broader claim that I'm trying to advance here is that as humans become more and more data, that reality needs to be acknowledged if we take ideas about human autonomy and human dignity seriously. So I think the broader claim, of course, then is data are becoming what we might think of as quintessentially human. And it's starting to define both our relationships to ourselves and our interactions with other people. So, you know, I'm clearly not the first person to note this. And will.i.am, who is from the hip hop group Black Eyed Peas, has been at the forefront of actually advancing ideas about how we deal with our human lives becoming more and more data. So I've thrown up a quote on the slide because I think it offers a fairly good argument for why personal data or data from people should just be made into property that could be compensated for. And I think that this is certainly one way we might think about data from people. Owning and controlling data does mean we treat it as property, and property rights are part of the grand corpus of human rights. And so we can think about this as an appropriate human rights response in some ways. But I think one problem with limiting data to just property rights, so just thinking about it as property, is that it becomes a market relationship that I think datafication goes beyond. And so datafication has affected our social relationships, political relationships, and our relationships to ourselves. So owning our data is really just part of the issue at hand. And it also puts a price on who you are. Practically speaking, I also think that just saying, oh, we just need to own our data loses sight of the importance of algorithms that analyze and make predictions based on the data. So it's not as simple, I think, in terms of thinking about human autonomy as claiming the data about oneself are for oneself because of the way the data are collected. I'll explain this later through the concept of co-creation. And also it discounts the role that algorithms play in generating value from the data that are collected. So I'll be talking through 4 central points today in the talk. First, I'll go through a little bit about what human rights are. And then I'll talk more about datafication and data use as concepts and how to think about their role in interacting with human rights, why it is difficult to apply human rights to data, some of the existing challenges to human rights that datafication pose. And if we have time, I can talk a little bit about my plan for the book going forward. Okay, so here's the fun interactive part of the presentation. I'm going to ask folks to throw in the chat, and I want to be able to see the chat, but if people could just throw in the chat ideas of what you think human rights are. So just give me some examples of what you think is protected by the current human rights regime. And I don't think there are any wrong answers, but let's see. Oh, don't be shy, guys. All right, there we go. Okay, great. We've got really good ideas here in the chat. I'll let you guys can continue putting them in because actually they're, yep, all these are great. So there's a wide variety, and yeah, Jillian, so that's a really good question. So there is a developing right to access to water. And there are a lot of things we might call human rights. So I'll explain how we determine what a human right is, but basically there are a lot of them. There are more than what people have put in there. There's a lot of social and economic rights out there that that we tend not to focus on in Western countries, but that are also a big part of what we might consider the human right, part of the big corpus of human rights. So lots of stuff. And so part of my job is to tell you that I'm here, they're not enough for the world we live in. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about why that is, or human rights in general. So the fact is human rights can get abstract very quickly because the definitions that we have, the broad-based definitions to tell us what human rights are some of these, they're more rhetorical than anything. For example, a common one you see is human rights are the rights that one has for being human, which begs the question of what a human is. They're often seen as entitlements for a life of human dignity. And I think these ideas, what they're trying to point to is that human rights are important because they're institutions that are trying to preserve human autonomy. So, and our ability to act as agents in the world. So something about autonomy and agency as we live our lives and what it entails to live a life of human agency. So certainly freedom of expression, but also things like the right to an education, right? These are, or right to health. These are all important elements of what it means to live a human life autonomously. So I think what's important for us about human rights is that they tell us about a life that we think humans should live, but maybe can't, or don't. There are things where we should be able to enjoy and can't be taken away from us because they're entitlements. So no one can take them away from us, whether governments or increasingly other entities like corporations or other non-state actors. But then what are quintessentially human things? Who decides what a human is and what are the things that humans are entitled to? So in my field, in political science and international relations specifically, which is the view I'm coming from, we focus a lot on the global politics of human rights. And what that means is that we look at how people have argued for rights to come into being at the global level, why some actually get broad global assent, and how they work. We tend to focus on formal binding legal instruments as evidence for how firm human rights are in international politics. And we sort of use the existence of binding law as evidence for human rights existence or importance. And that actually has implications for how political scientists tend to understand human rights. It tends to be a little bit narrower than in other fields because we don't tend to take into account the rights that are sort of emerging, like the right to water, for example. We also view human rights as a political project. And so we're looking for the reasoning behind and the reasons for why human rights exist at the international level and their effect on other levels of governance, like the domestic or the local. And so we want to explain often why some rights succeed as international human rights and others don't. So to be clear, this is the political science view, and there are many different ways of thinking about human rights and many different levels of analysis one could adopt because the study of human rights is actually quite interdisciplinary. But my particular perspective is informed by thinking about human rights at the global level and not necessarily thinking about domestic developments. So in addition to preserving something we call human dignity, which we can think of as protecting autonomy and also protecting humans from harm. Human rights is really focused on treating people as ends in and of themselves and not means to an end. And this idea can be applied to individuals or groups. So if we think about international human rights and their development, this really starts in 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, somebody referred to in the chat. It's commonly referred to as the UDHR. And the UDHR was a pretty expansive set of rights that were stated at a very general level, aspirational. It led to a series of legally binding international legal conventions and other aspirational declarations and extensions of what it means to protect human rights. And nearly all these documents are really outlining behaviors that states are expected to follow. So it's about what states do. And that makes sense because these are all international legal documents. So political scientists tend to refer to a few of these conventions in our work, and some of the ones that we focus on often are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, on the Convention Against Torture. There's some work done on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are a number of these major legal documents that political scientists tend to focus our efforts on as ways to assess how these legal instruments affect state behavior, how they reflect or change domestic institutions and allow domestic actors such as NGOs or judges or legislators to act differently. And my past work, thinking about how non-state actors like NGOs, non-governmental organizations, have either been at the forefront of creating human rights or leveraging human rights to compel certain types of behavior from states. So datafication really disrupts our conception of human rights because these rights that I've talked about are largely about physical lives. They're about what I call physical you in my conception. And they're about providing the capacities for people to live lives of dignity and to equip them with autonomy to make choices about how they want to live their lives. They're about physical bodies interacting with physical bodies. And so datafication is creating a data you, but this is not to date been thought of as part of human rights, this data part of who you are. If you look at there's the little picture on the bottom corner, the black and white little house. That's a diagram from the conception of the UDHR. It's commonly called the portico. This is René Cassin's vision of how human rights fit together. He was a French jurist who was very influential in helping create the narrative around the UDHR. And so at the bottom, you see that there are basic notions of dignity, liberty, equality, and brotherhood that form the foundation of the 30 articles of the UDHR. And I think it's increasingly becoming clear that these foundational elements of the UDHR, these things that are not part of the formal document of the UDHR, but nonetheless form the foundation for our understanding of the importance of human rights, these foundational elements are not making as much sense as they used to in an era of datafication if we don't acknowledge that data are us. Most of us don't know what happens to our data once it's collected, if we're aware of this is happening at all. We may not be able to exercise control over it, even if we knew where these data were going. And so this really cuts against our abilities to exercise at least the basic rights of freedom and equality. And I would argue this idea of autonomy, that how to live as a free agent in the world. So to date, a lot of the human rights research that looks at datafication is looking at certain aspects of human rights or certain human rights that are being challenged. So for example, privacy or consent. And these are extremely important concerns to be sure, but they are not the only ways that datafication is affecting human rights and how we use them. So what I'm suggesting is that datafication is marking a fundamental shift in the way we live, and its corresponding effects on you as an individual, but then also us as a collective, this idea, this gendered term of brotherhood that was used. So it affects our dignity because it affects you as a person and also all of us as a collective. And the scope of datafication is so vast, it's so huge. So we have to start thinking about people as both physical and as data. So this is not to say that human rights should have taken data you into account in its inception, of course, because no one could have really predicted these types of technological changes. But that being said, the vocabulary to talk about data you and its relationship to human rights doesn't quite exist yet, and we need to change that, or that shouldn't be the case. So I was recently listening to a podcast by Kara Swisher where she interviews Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, to talk about privacy, because this is something that Apple is trying to position itself vis-a-vis the unspoken other company, which is Facebook, and other social media companies and companies that collect a lot of data. So Apple is trying to talk about how its vision of the world is different. And this is sort of Tim Cook's idea of why collecting a lot of data is a bad thing for all of us as individuals. I think we can sum up what he says about somebody is always watching. It's not just what it's what you're thinking, it's what you're doing. And so it creates this chilling effect on individuals. You begin to do less, you begin to think less. This is, I think, a feeling of being trapped and a sense of a loss of autonomy. And this is something that, a lot of us, I think, would resist or fight against, or at least find concerning. And so this is a familiar way of thinking about the human rights implications of datafication, but I think there's more to this story than just what Tim's talking about here. And I think that has to do with the qualities of data. Okay, so, many of us as researchers, I think, take the idea of data for granted. And so I want to sort of spend some time to think about some of the qualities of data that make it difficult when we think about it in terms of both the scope of it, the scope of their effects on our lives, but then also for how human rights might deal with that datafication. So I think there's a lot of understandings of data. The one that makes sense to me is data are ways to make information tractable. And so data don't just exist in the world, they have to be generated. Another way to think about it is there's no such thing as raw data, because somebody has to decide what to study and then collect those data in order to study those things. So we, the researcher, the firm, the government, have to make the world more tractable, and we have to make a series of decisions about how to do that. So when we're dealing in the world of computers, we're talking, of course, about the digitization of the world. So the idea of both quantifying and then binaryfying the world and creating the data that we're interested in. And still more refined, I'm interested in data about or data from persons. And so this is not a group that I think I have to spend a lot of time explaining why this is an important distinction from personal data, because I think a lot of speakers have talked about this in the past. But colloquially, when we think about data from persons or about persons, it's often thought of as personal data, which stuff like names, phone numbers, personally identifying information. And that's certainly data about persons, but as we know, datafication is generating a lot more data about persons. So I had a whole bunch of examples to start the talk, but I don't want to belabor this point, but there's a whole bunch of data out there about persons that could be personally identifiable if there's enough data out there and it's linked together. So data about persons or data about persons taken in isolation may not matter that much, but in conjunction from other sources, then we can start making extrapolations about the who we're talking about. And so this idea of distinguishing between personal data and non-personal data, which is often used by governments and corporations in these conversations about rights, is not really that relevant. We're not talking, I think, policymakers and companies are not talking about the types of data that are gathered from our interactions with their products and platforms. So, either you're thinking about the way Shoshana Zuboff talks about behavioral surplus, or the way Ron Deibert has talked about how social media are basically designed to suck data from their users. I think these are more complete ways to think about data from persons and why it's important to think about how data U is constructed. So this concept of data U is really trying to capture the idea that there are all these data that are being collected about us that result in a datafied life in this entity called data U, but acknowledging that data U is actually not always a coherent entity. In fact, that's how it's a little different from physical you, but there are lots of data about you that you have personally supplied, either explicitly or implicitly. And then there's also data generated from you, the predictions that have been made based on data that has been collected. And so data you exists as data, but while you are the source of its existence, you do not exercise full agential control over. So to back up a little bit, I think one thing is that I want to make clear that collecting data about people is not a new practice from the modern day. In fact, individuals have had data collected on them for quite some time. Classification and record keeping has been a human practice for millennia. But what makes datafication different in the current day is that we are creating much more granular and extensive data about many, many more people than we have in the past because of the capacity for both collection and storage of that data. And that's an important point to make. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of data stickiness, because it sort of forms the basis for why we have to think about the trickiness for thinking about how human rights might come in and govern datafication. So data are sticky for the 4 reasons that are on the slide. But before I get to those, data are also easily copied and transferred. And so in economics terms, we can think about data as non-rival and only partially excludable. And in addition to that, there are these 4 other ways that data pose a challenge for how to think about human rights. The first is its mundaneness. So the great majority of data from people are actually quite mundane. It's about everyday activities that have value when we collect them across a population, but also just having the clicks and the sort of mundane activity that we engage in as part of being alive or part of interacting with a platform being recorded and then analyzed, categorized, and generating predictions from. These are all mundane things. They're not exactly exciting. And so on the one hand, you can think of this as pretty costless collection of data. But in his memoir, Hall Kelly, who also writes for the Globe and Mail, notes that in fact, it is what he calls the banalities, but mundane is sort of the same thing. The banalities of life are the things that actually make a human life. It's these things that we, as he says, we so rarely discuss amongst ourselves, but that we devote most of our energies to navigating. How did that day you've forgotten look? What did it feel like? Were you lonely? Did you have a sense you were progressing anywhere? Probably not. Yet string a few thousand of them together, and that's a life. And I think he says it quite well when, in terms of, we don't value these mundane activities, but they actually form the backbone of who we are. The next reason why data are sticky is that they're linked. So the data collected about you doesn't just stay within one organization. Because data have great economic value and social value, data can be sold and traded and passed along. Now, there are positive things that come from linking data, and we learn a lot in terms of making advances in medicine and other fields, but there can be also negative effects in terms of on a personal level, how these data move. Data are also effectively forever. And this is because data, again, can transfer easily between users. And so one of the things that I think we keep learning as a society is that even though data are deleted, or we think they're deleted, there are ways that they can keep coming back to get us, or to in some cases, to affect our opportunities in life. The final characteristic about data that make them sticky is this idea of co-creation. So you are the source of data, but someone else is interested in that data to begin with. And so new data are created through a collaboration between the data collector, let's say the company, and the source of data, which is you. So without you, there'd be no data, but without the company, there would also be no data. And so this co-creation characteristic poses a practical problem if we think in human rights terms about whose data they are. Are they yours because you're the source? Or are they the companies because they're the creators of that data? It's worth pointing out, I think, and it's really important to think about the fact that the stakes are probably higher for you than they are for the data collectors, or for the person, the source, rather than the company. Because data really needs to be in the aggregate for it to have value for any data collector. It's the aggregation that really reveals the important information and creates value. And so it's important to keep that in mind. But when you as an individual or you as a person give access to all these data about you, you're actually giving away tremendous power for knowing who you are, and for the potential for those data to affect you going forward. So there's a disparity there in terms of interest. I think it's also really important to point out that as individuals, it's very difficult for us to exit out of the digital world that we've created. And I'm not just talking about apps, but the way that societies are organized around computerized data and the way that we store information. So it speaks to autonomy in the sense that there is no exit from the system, and yet we currently don't have a lot of ways to think about how to shift the power balance in terms of co-creation. I think from a human rights perspective, the way we think about data really treats humans as a means to an end. So whether that is wealth generation or some social benefit, and we don't see the data from people as people, and therefore we don't treat it as ends in of themselves. And the other sort of questionable thing is thinking about how we put monetary value across the various dimensions of individuals, and what that really implies about the connection to, or the sort of disconnect between the source of the data and the data themselves. Okay, so it's really deciding the balance over whose data it is. I think that will be really the linchpin in deciding how we think about one aspect of datafication and human rights, which is data rights. Whose data is it? So there are a few other reasons, I think, why human rights need a reboot when we talk about datafication. So beyond the concerns inherent to data themselves, there are three that I generally think I talk about in the book. So part of what human rights needs to do, I think, to deal with datafication adequately, is to fix or revisit some of the concepts we already know. So thinking about how datafication affects freedom of expression, consent and privacy, which there is a lot of really good research on and thinking about, but also of property, which I talked about early on in this talk. I think all those are things that people have really been trying to think about how datafication challenges these basic human rights that we've come to accept. But I think that there are three other ways that datafication really challenges fundamental assumptions that are made in human rights. So, the first is that, and I'll go through these in a minute. So the first is that human rights are for physical life. Human rights are mostly about relationships between the state and persons or groups, and that humans are unitary agents. But I think that these sort of assumptions need to be revisited and in order for us to recast the boundaries of what human rights mean and how they can respond better to the datafication of our lives. So let me just talk through these here. The first question is about the human rights are for a physical life. So at present, human rights are trying to prevent you from dying. There are lots of rights about the fact we can't commit genocide. You can't commit torture. There are things that try to keep you from dying and to keep humans from being harmed physically, generally. But there are developments now that are really pushing on the question of how data can act in the world, whether we're physically around or not. So this is Robert Kardashian, Kim Kardashian's dad. There was a moment on the internet when his hologram made a surprise visit to her 40th birthday last year, and it sort of blew up the internet for a few days, asking whether this was okay to bring him back because he'd been dead since 2003 and her birthday was just last year. And although his interaction with the world was pretty scripted, it's clear that the one who gifted Kim, Kanye West, had written a lot of the script. It sort of reminds us that our data, so the face, the voice, the image, do not necessarily die with us, and in fact can be brought back. And this isn't just a party gimmick like Robert Kardashian's hologram. I'm going to show a few slides here of a patent that Microsoft secured last year to create a chatbot of a specific person. Sorry, here we go. Let's see. Of a specific person, past or present, based on someone's social data, which is a large net. They've cast a wide net of what constitutes social data, but it's basically everything from emails to social media to even written, analog content such as written documents. This chatbot could, if necessary, consult other data sources if necessary to converse with somebody. And it could also come with an image and voice depending on the types of data provided. So this is a different kind of way to revive data from dead or alive people, as it were. But it speaks to this idea that that the data are out there to create someone, a chatbot of someone, a specific person, whether or not that person is aware or even consents. And I think, chatbots aren't a new thing for us because they do exist, and the technology around them is improving with great speed. That's not the issue. I think the issue really is the question of how chatbots of a real person can interact with the world, and whether the mistakes that chatbots have been documented to make are more consequential if they're about a real person, about a real you, and a bot who answers as you, if those consequences are greater than if it was a general chatbot that's designed to chat with the world, not based on anyone at all. And so part of me is, curious in imagining the kinds of things that could get revealed in a chatbot based on a specific person and their data, unless we carefully consider how that data would be sifted, presented. So Microsoft's not the only actor in this space. There are actually a lot of options that are currently available. They're not as sophisticated as what Microsoft proposes, but they are chatbots either available, either based on real people or who learn from real people to be your friend, as it were. So there are a lot of examples out there, and this technology is really in its infancy. Now, the next assumption sort of that I want to push back on with regard to human rights is their assumption about the centrality of the state. And in fact, there have been calls in the past decade or two about the need for corporations to step up and be responsible for protecting human rights, because there's a general understanding that the current framework that is very state focused is also very limited. So that's been, a part of the international human rights framework in terms of expanding the scope of responsibility beyond states. But I think it's a much bigger step to really think about how corporations might one day be enforcing and protecting human rights in the same way that we've come to expect states to do. So Facebook effectively governs online speech or freedom of expression for its 2.8 billion users on its platform. And it has a sense of what freedom of expression, a fundamental human right, should look like enforced through its own community standards. It also has a sense of what freedom of expression should cost. As many of us know, it recently blocked Australian news from its platform in a dispute with pending Australian legislation about how news content should be paid for. The law passed in February, and Facebook eventually did work out a payment schedule and also was able to influence the shape of that law. But nonetheless, Facebook had a sense of what it wanted in terms of enforcing the idea and having a say in enforcing freedom of expression. It's also created the Facebook Oversight Board to review decisions about posted content and make binding decisions about the removal of content and eventually the posting of content. But the Facebook Oversight Board was formed in part because there was a lot of response about how these community standards were more or less arbitrarily enforced by Facebook. There was rarely any explanation for why these things happened. And so the board is supposed to be about reviewing some of these Facebook decisions. Now, it's a very small fraction of the removals that Facebook engages in on a daily basis. But it is a move that is explicitly about supporting people's right to freedom of expression. And it's identified explicitly in the board's charter as being a fundamental human right that Facebook is invested in helping to protect. So while we can say that implicitly Facebook has become an enforcer of freedom of expression de facto because it's so prevalent as a platform for so many people around the world, it's now explicit with both the board and its face-off in Australia and its current negotiations here in Canada. Right, the final point I want to talk about in terms of some of the problematic assumption in the way we think about human rights is the unitariness of humans. And what I mean by that is, the prevalence of biometric data, whether we're thinking about genetic data, fingerprints, retinal scanners, facial data, but also things like gait and typing patterns. So the prevalence of biometric data is creating a situation where humans are not necessarily unitary wholes, but we can actually think about aspects of us in pieces, in ways that are datafied. Now, I think this has real privacy concerns, of course, but I think it also poses a fundamental challenge in thinking about how different pieces of us can be separated as data. So what does that mean for our conceptions of humanity, but also of what human rights should be protecting? And I think this is an especially topical debate because we already have had lots of documented discriminatory practices using facial data and facial recognition data, and thinking about some of the ways that these facial data are being used against certain populations. And so thinking about how humans can be separated into various pieces as data, I think, is a real key conundrum that human rights needs to address. So I think, sort of in summary, in thinking about the balance between human rights and data, or to think about how to apply human rights and data, there are a few challenges or a few things that we need to keep in mind. So the first is, I think, maintaining the difference between data and algorithms, which are fundamentally entwined and engaged in a virtuous cycle, in the sense that that the algorithmic sophistication and the development drives the need to have more and more data, which then drives the need to create ways that we can analyze and make predictions from that data. I think it's sort of, they build on each other, but I think we need to think about them as separate things that human rights needs to deal with. There's the data part, and then there's the algorithmic part, and how algorithms affect human rights is a different kind of question from how the datafication of our lives is affecting our ways to apply human rights. Neither of these things are really covered by human rights right now, but I do think it's worth thinking about both the distinction and then the way they mutually reinforce one another. I also think there's a big trade-off between thinking about the right to privacy specifically and sort of the knowledge benefits that datafication provides, both for individuals and for societies at large. And I don't think it's a simple answer. I don't think that coming down on one side or another is really the right answer. And it's really about a balancing act of thinking about what the benefits of both of those things are. Clearly, in extremes in either direction are not the answer going forward. Finally, I think that we need to shift our conception about personhood in a couple ways. One is to really rethink data about people, and to ensure that we both properly identify and then consider the ways that some types of data about people may not be worth the sort of trade-off that I talked about with privacy and knowledge, for example. We also should think about how data you will likely outlive all of our physical use, and what to do with that, and whether or not we have choice over that, whether that's something that can be dealt with through reconceptualizing how human beings are thought of. And so in the book, the way I'm going to be tackling this is through a series of questions that I've raised in the talk today. So, really thinking through in different chapters what it means to go beyond the state when we think about human rights, the effect of biometrics, and in thinking about people as data parts as opposed to maybe coherent physical wholes. What happens to our data when we die? And then I also want to take on this idea of the right to be forgotten, which has been developing in the past few years, especially in Europe. And I want to reconceptualize that into thinking about the right to make mistakes, because really what we're concerned with, I think, a lot of times is how data can potentially harm people in ways that they don't expect going forward. And I don't think that's necessarily about forgetting, but it's about rethinking how we calibrate people's mistakes, and take that into account when we give them opportunities and access to in the future. And I think finally that one of the things I do want to do in the book is to learn from existing things and how we think about rights. And so one of the other things that I think is analogous to data, it's one of the few things that I've thought of. So if there are others, I'd love to hear feedback on that, but is the creation of music. And music is co-created in the sense that there are multiple players who have claim over any piece of music. So when we think about the artist, the musical artist is usually what we think about as consumers, but there's also the songwriter, and there are producers, and there are record labels and other players who have claims to music and the ownership of music. And we've established a really clear sense of copyright. And so if we do think about data as property, perhaps music is one way that we can learn, or one direction we can learn from with that. So thank you very much.
Oh, Wendy, that was so fantastic. So many shifts in perspective. That's just mind is exploding here. Should we stop the share so we can see everybody? And I'm going to go to Rhonda first. It's been a busy day for you.
Yes, I've seen you before.
Our 4-hour
today.
session, yeah, before this, right? Go ahead.
First of all, thank you so much, Wendy. So great. I have a couple of questions, but I can't take up all the time. So I'm going to start with one. I'm on my COVID project. I've been thinking about data in a slightly different way. Maybe it's the same way. Maybe I just want your opinion on this. So when you talked about whose data it really all is, when I think about if you go get a COVID test and that data, it's yours, but it's really not being used as yours. Yes, your health situation, but really what we want to know is who else did you talk to, stand next to, right? Like we need to find out all that. And that's for the public good. So there's this right, and the reason it's on my mind is because contrasting the way a lot of my Chinese participants in my study in China think about this data and the way we're thinking about the data in the West is very, very different. So as far as they're concerned, this data belongs to everyone because it's about a public safety issue that is reliant on my little piece to this contribution. But the way that we think, we're still in this data, even the way we frame these things, it's about this individual, this data belongs to me. And you kind of raise this in a little bit in some of the things you were thinking. Are there some instances or maybe other places where we're not thinking of data in the same kind of way? And is there, there's a tension, but is there some way to bring these two things together?
Yeah, I mean, I really like that question because part of it brings up this sort of age-old debate in human rights about, Western values versus Asian values, or, what's been framed as the Asian values debate. And I think, I think my answer to that question is, yes, you can think about the data as in different ways, but fundamentally it does belong to a person. And so let me rephrase, it has come from a person. Right? So whether or not you think about, the usefulness of that, and you emphasize the knowledge part. So maybe, in different contexts, we might think about its value to the whole is greater than my claim to the fact that it's about me. I think that's a totally valid way to think about it. But I do think at bottom, I think what I'm trying to point out is that no matter how, if you think about it as a very positive thing, and this is, not everyone has to agree that the emphasis should be on the individual, I think, but it does, the data do come from an individual, and that matters. And I think that's been really overlooked. Whether or not we structure, or whether cultural norms around understanding how the individual fits into the whole will of course shape the emphasis that you place on the rights to data. But I do think that that if we don't emphasize that connection to the source of the data, that we're missing a huge chunk of what it means to be human and part of the human experience now. So yeah, I hope that answers.
No, that was great. And so this is like, you ended right where my second little question is. And are you familiar with David Gunkel's work on robot rights?
No.
Okay, so he's like a bit of a communication philosophy person, and he has a whole book, 2018, on robot rights.
Okay.
And what's interesting is he tries to take these sort of philosophical arguments from Hume and others about how we come up with this, when you kicked us off with what is human rights, right? That sort of thing. And then if you proxy it into sort of an AI world, it shows, one, that it doesn't really work. Two, that robots shouldn't have rights, yet they do have rights, yet we shouldn't give them rights, right? Like to go through this iteration of this. So I wonder, as you evolve this in your book, this idea of human rights and data and so on, do you have an opinion or a perspective here on this, where this is headed?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that, Rhonda, because I mean, I figured someone would ask me this question, right? So I thought about it this morning. So I think I've made a conscious effort in this project to get away from that question of whether non-humans deserve rights. And it's not to say that that's not a fruitful line of thinking. In fact, this book sounds really useful in a lot of ways for this project. But I hate to be anthropomorphic about this, but I think that humans have a hard enough time ensuring that other humans are protected from harm, that to then port that to a non-human entity, I think that is definitely something that others have thought about quite a lot. It's not the focus of this project, because I think I'm really concerned with the fact that all of us have yet to directly confront the shift in our reality in a human rights way, like in a coherent human rights, like how does this actually challenge some of the assumptions that we've made about human rights and how they apply? So I think that that's an excellent point. But I mean, this project started out thinking about how AI, so how the algorithms affect human rights. And I think I've just kind of focused on the data in a way to make it a more tractable project, but also because I think that marks a fundamental shift in the constitution of humans, as opposed to algorithms, which I see as very much how we assess one another and how we build tools to do the things that we've done before, which is classify and understand different human beings. And I don't know if that's necessarily as much of a challenge to human rights as thinking about the importance of data.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Anita.
Wendy, it's great to see you, and thank you for an amazing talk and all these super interesting ideas and provocative questions. My question relates to what defines humanness. It's very related to what Rhonda was raising, but I always think of humanness as defined by sentience. In other words, the ability to sense, the ability to feel and to feel without any provocation or movement. In other words, to feel without having to interact, right? Or even to be prompted to feel. And that's what distinguishes humanness from robotic representations of humans, which are stimulated to feel by some sort of external pressure of some kind. That leads me to the question of, and by the way, I love the idea that we need to rethink human rights. I love the idea that we need to think about data protections and we need to think about data as connected to individuals. But I wanted just to ask, doesn't data U break down if we think of UNIS requiring sentience?
Yes, I think it does, which is so I mean, data U is not a separate entity, right? It is really part of U, so capital Y U. And so if you think about, there's a U and then there's at least two parts, and that's the physical U, right, which I argue is well protected by human rights. And then there's this whole data U that is new, that we, relatively new, and we really need to think about both the link to physical U and how data U is, to what extent that's a a reflection extension. I'm not really sure what the right noun is, but the unus of data you, right? So is it going to be independently sentient, excuse me? No, I don't think of it as a robot. I think of it as data about you that doesn't live in your body, right? It lives on servers, right? Other people have that data. And so, you know, in that sense, it's not about sentience. And I think this relates well to Rhonda's question too, about like, you know, are you thinking about robots? And I'm not. And I think the way that it comes close is when I talk about data you after we're dead, or even data you when we're alive, that there's some, you know, there's some social media platforms that experiment with creating essentially a data you. They don't call it that, but they call it, it's a version of you that responds as though it's you, whether you actually type in the responses, or it can generate responses for you in the guise of you, right? So it starts acting a little bit, it starts just shifting more towards this question of whether that's sentience or whether that's just a mimic of the data that you've left behind and the algorithms making predictions on what you would have done.
I mean, I think of it as my property. Maybe that's incomplete. And the data that I generate is my property. And sometimes there are other claims on property rights on that data. But so is this a question about whether or not someone who has passed away still has property rights?
No, I mean, I think then we would have to rethink property rights, right? Because I don't think we tend to think that dead people have property rights in like the house and car kind of sense, right? I think that's a really good question. The way, you know, and we maybe can think about it as intellectual property, but, you know, so in like, what is intellectual property? I mean, my understanding is that the difficulty with applying the law and the norms around intellectual property to data from dead people is that, or people in general, data from people in general, is that it's not creative, right? It's mundane.
Well, I need to let Jillian ask the next question.
Yeah, I've got a line up here, man, so.
Yeah, so but this is, so I'm not a lawyer, so like I actually want to hear from folks who can speak to that. So why isn't it, I mean, I think Anita, it's I think data for sure are being treated as property, and I think I think that my point with that is that it sort of collapses the value of the data from people into one dimension, which is that who owns it, right? Who has the claim over it? And I think that it's more than that. I think it's speaking to a broader range of relationships beyond the market. I think it goes to our social relationships, our political relationships, and our relationships to ourselves. So.
Great, thank you so much. There's so much in there. Karina.
Hi, hi Wendy, thanks for the talk. Nice to see you. I actually wanted to change the focus a little bit, even though I find this conversation that's going on really interesting. But I was really struck by the quote you gave from Tim Cook. And I was kind of thinking, my reaction to that initially was that it didn't seem to me that that was sort of what is most concerning about sort of the data collection and the infringement on autonomy. And I think what concerns me is that is not that people feel less free, but that in fact, sometimes we feel even more free than ever. Like we feel actually really free and our sense of freedom isn't affected. But in fact, we're maybe not as free as we think we are. So there's actually something deceiving about that. So it's not that we're consciously feeling less free and so we don't bother searching for things. It's actually like we feel so free, and at this one level, we can search for anything we want on YouTube. We can watch anything that we want on TV. We didn't used to be able to just turn on and watch whatever we wanted. So there's a sense in which we do have a lot more freedom, but there's this other level at which that these technologies are impacting our autonomy, and we're only being shown certain things. So there's sort of a sense in which or a kind of concept of autonomy where we can separate how we feel subjectively from how free we actually are. And I think that separation is important. And I guess I'm just inviting you to say a little bit more about kind of what you mean by autonomy and what you think about that. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I'm just writing it down.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, thanks, Karina. I mean, I think autonomy, so I haven't thought about subjective experiences of autonomy versus, I guess, objective autonomy. I don't know what the sort of like the actual autonomy you have versus how you feel about it, right? And I think on the one hand, people, so I wonder if there's a shift. So this is an empirical question that I hope that someone answers, which is, given the amount of attention that's been paid to the way that social media and other tech companies collect data about people, do people feel less autonomous now, knowing that the YouTube algorithm is trapping you into watching more and more extreme videos, or that the way that you see your Facebook feed is determined by what Facebook thinks you want to see and what you've liked in the past? So I don't know. I think that's an open question. For me, autonomy is really about, it's sort of a capacity question. It's so to me, like, human rights as a sort of corpus of laws and norms are really focused on equipping people to live, to borrow this phrase, their best life, right? In a way, it's about, you can't, there are certain things that states and other states can't do. They can't harm you physically in the ways that a lot of people think about, which is like torture. They can't deny you your right to a fair trial, that sort of thing. But they also have to enable you to be able to live a life, the best life you possibly can. So you have to have shelter, you have to have access to food and education and healthcare, and you have to be free to marry who you want, right? And I think that's how my perspective on autonomy is, that's where I'm coming from. But I mean, yeah, I think the question of how people experience and use autonomy is a really interesting question. And I thought it was really great that, Tim Cook is talking about this in a directly human rights way. I hadn't seen that in the past. And so, yeah, I think it's a good way to highlight it. I'm not sure whether the chilling effect is a real thing, but that is something that a lot of human rights activists who talk about surveillance, for example, do say, right? Is that if people living under surveillance conditions don't say and act the way that they maybe otherwise would. So.
Yeah, that's a nice point, actually. Yeah, and maybe it's just worth thinking both about the hidden influences and the things that we're not aware of, we don't feel are going on, and all the effects of those kind of algorithms that are happening behind the scenes, as it were. And then as well as both the influences that aren't hidden and the chilling effects of those influences. So maybe it's happening in both ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be interesting to think about how, I mean, people probably, they act differently on Snapchat than they would on other media that might be more obviously archived, right? Versus a technology that's designed to disappear after being read. And so, what happens when Snapchat was hacked a few years ago, right? And all of a sudden, all these disposable files were actually shared, right? And so, like, how would that play into this idea of autonomy for people? Yeah.
Great. We have a little less than 20 minutes and 4 hands up. So I'm going to go to Benjamin, then Lisa, Jack, and Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. I was wondering about, so there's a book in philosophy that I thought might be of interest to you. It's called The Extended Mind, which was arguing that if we have the right relation to external things, digital things, they could count as part of our mind. So like the example, it doesn't necessarily need to be digital even. The example they use is like, if you someone with who's losing their memory, who has a diary that they consult, and that sort of could be an externalization of their memory. You can think of the memento guy with his tattoos, it's the same idea. And of course you could think of digital things doing that work. But then that led me to worry about some of the other cases of data, because often the key there is that we have sort of easy and immediate access to this so that we can use it as a component of our mind. And it actually even, I think, helps address Anita's worry a little, because it's part of us because it's linked to the bit of us that's sentient, right? Without necessarily being itself sentient, because obviously there are bits of our mind that count as us without themselves feeling anything because they're linked to the fields. But then I was wondering, there seem like there are a lot of this data we don't have easy access to in that way. And I can't go out and look it up. I don't even know what's out there. And then I wonder, so is that me? And if so, why isn't your impression of me also me in the same way? Like lots of human beings have this same kind of, model of me and could maybe impersonate me or and so does that raise the same worries? And if not, why not? So there's a bit of a roundabout way to get to the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you snuck in 2 questions in 1 question, right? So, which is great. So why isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I think where you ended is why is, people make judgments about people all the time. So what's the difference here? I think the difference is the widespread, not the widespread, but the scope of it. Again, so I might judge you because I interact with you, and other people might judge you because they interact with you. But they're contingent on our ability to actually interact in real time and space. And so when we think about public figures, like political figures or celebrities, right, they're often judged for their actions, and for better or for worse, like that, they benefit from that. But I think what makes us different is that the potential for all of us to become those people. And I think that's what I mean by scope. It's that all of a sudden, it's not just famous people who would otherwise have been memorialized in history books already. It's that we are all, all of us living our mundane lives are also being recorded in this way and archived and have predictions made upon us. Yeah, the extended mind thesis, I think Karina's actually brought that up in other conversation as well. And I really think I think that's a really interesting path that I want to think about a little bit more. I do think though, if that's the case, then this is, Elon Musk says that your phone is basically your mind, but it's in your hand, right? And if we take that seriously, I think then that's a real issue because we don't protect the phone in the same way we would protect your brain or your mind, right? And these, I'm always reminded also of just the technological challenges to protecting the data or the data that are collected about you because data can be hacked, technology can change, things can become outdated and not updated. And things can be lost because we change the format or the way that we think what is the best way to collect data and analyze it, right? So there are all these technological challenges in addition. If we start thinking about, okay, the data that are collected are actually me, they're not just things I've made, they're not artifacts, they're actually revealing something about me that I think is fundamental to my existence.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. And just a plug, Karina is talking about the extended mind next week, so it's wonderful. AI extenders. Lisa.
I feel like I need an extended mind these days, so I'm really excited that we're going to be talking about this. Wendy, so I love your project, and when I was thinking about it as you were talking, and we've talked about it before, I think about it in context of an interest of mine, which is, what are the limits of privacy law and the data protection law framework, and how can we start to think about new alternatives to it? And so, there were sort of 2 things I thought were going on with what you were articulating here. One I'll just sort of put to you, and then the other I have a question about. So one is just, when I hear about you talking about rights over data about you and using a human rights framework, I see that as just this really welcome project to say, let's get beyond just thinking about privacy all the time. There's a broader range of interests and values. And how do we start thinking about that? Human rights gives us a framework for thinking about that, but let's not be really simplistic about just bringing that framework in. That framework needs to evolve itself. We need to think critically about that. And I think that's terrific. The part that I have a question about, I'm sort of intrigued about and wanting to hear more about, and I know you're just developing your thinking about this, is when you were starting to talk about the data you, and I have sort of questions about the boundaries around it, because privacy law talks about control over personal information. So it is a way of thinking about something that many people see as a kind of quasi property right, although I don't like that framing personally. It's about control. There's a lot of autonomy kind of, there. And it's about personal information, so information about you. But you also said in one of your slides that you don't like the personal data. So personal data or personal information or personally identifiable information, right? Different jurisdictions use different language. It all means pretty much the same thing. That's too limiting. So data you is something different than what data protection law talks about. It's protecting. But data protection law has had lots of trouble around defining personal information, regulating on the basis of personal information. Like it's got this whole kind of thicket and quagmire of issues around it. So what are you proposing that's different than that? And how are you sort of avoiding that thorny, horrible problem that plagues privacy law when trying to give individuals more control over their personal information.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. You know, you always ask these really difficult questions to answer. So, but you know, I have to admit that my thinking around personal data has really changed since, you know, reading the stuff you and David and Sasha and Nicola have all worked on with regard to thinking about personal data and the outmodedness in thinking about data about people as personal data or not, right? And in terms of thinking about de-identification and how flimsy of a tool that can be in an age where there's so much data about people out there. So, you know, how do you, and I think this is a, you know, when I think about this concept of data, it can get very big because of course the types of data that are being collected about people are things that, you know, that have such huge range. And I think the potentiality to really encircle all of the types of data that are being collected and to really create law around that is something I'm sort of glad as a political scientist I don't have to do. But one, I think to start answering the question is that I think it's important, as you do, to make distinctions around what is using human rights to make us to start thinking about what are things that are fundamental to who we are and revealing of who we are versus stuff that's maybe more interesting to know, but is otherwise maybe inconsequential. So the stuff that I mentioned today in the talk, I think is all pretty important to think about, but maybe not the amount of time you spend reading a particular news story. Like that's data about you, but you know, is that really going to reveal, you know, very consequential things about who you are in the way that, you know, your gait might or data about your face might? I think that's where we can maybe draw distinctions. And I think one way I would hope that the policy making around data would evolve is just thinking, okay, it's not that we're not going to collect data anymore about people. I think that that's a non-starter. But what types of data are we not allowed to collect about people and how we judge that, I think, is not just on personally identifiable, but about what kinds of consequences those data can have on people if they were, you know, if those data are associated with people, right? Is it going to result in them getting denied credit? Is it going to result in losing their job? I think that's where we start thinking about that. That's where we start making those distinctions.
Super. Thank you very much, Jack.
Hello, sorry about that. I have a question about commodification, because I like the part where you said that our data was us. I think all sorts of things are us. I think my hat is me, and part of why I think that is that I read Margaret Jane Radin's Property and Personhood many years ago. But then, you know, after she wrote about that, she wrote on contested commodities. And the idea that our concern with property and personhood is when our personhood becomes commodified in the sense of being saleable and tradable in the market. And in this regard, the moral rights that you brought up with respect to copyright are very interesting, because the moral rights are personal, non-transferable, but all the other copyrights you can sell just fine, in just the way that we're worried about people selling their data. So I wondered if commodification is not part of the story that you're telling, and is it meanness in my data which triggers sort of a shift from like legal rights to human rights that aren't commodified, or is it something else in there? If things that are commodified can also be me, like the rest of copyrights or my hat.
Yeah, I mean, so my understanding of how, you know, how privacy or the sort of the contestation around who owns an image of a face, for example, right? Starting with Kodak cameras is exactly this line that you're talking about, which is that if someone's making a profit off my face, then I have an ability to make claims against it. If you've just taken a picture of me at Kensington Market or something, then I don't have a claim one way or another to stop you from doing that. And so is it the sale of the person's data that I find problematic? No, no. And I think this is how I'm different from someone like Shoshana Zuboff, right? I actually think it's the collection of these data about people that are revealing about who they are that is something that should give us pause. And whether you commodify it or not, that's a side issue that I think, this is why as much as I think Will.i.am's got a point about ownership of personal data, I do think, or data about people, I do think that it's not just the fact that someone's making money off of me that is really the issue, because then people say, well, I'm getting to use Google for free. I think that that's not the trade. The trade-off is actually it's much more than just a monetary relationship. It's actually you as a person, the data that are being collected are revealing of things that maybe you don't think about outside of the monetary relationship, but that you should.
Okay, thank you.
I
Matthew,
love your
last question.
hat, by the way, Jack. I do.
And it looks like a sunny backyard. Matthew, last question, please.
All right, thank you very much, Wendy, for this talk. Greatly enjoyed it. My question actually sort of builds off a little bit of what Jack was talking about, especially with moral rights. And I guess my question is, to what extent do you see sort of the data you overlapping with something that the law sort of protects, which is sort of the reputational you, right? So we have various reputational laws. Moral rights is one thing that protects the reputation of the artist. We also have personality rights. So and this actually sort of dovetails with what you're talking about with this AI construct of somebody after they're dead, because there's been a long debate in personality rights about what happens after somebody dies and whether or not somebody can say, slap your face up on a billboard after you're dead in association with something. In fact, Apple notably ran into this when they did their Think Different campaign, and they were using like Einstein, right? They just threw Einstein up, Think Different, Einstein's family wasn't getting anything. And so, I think there's an interesting question of whether or not a lot of what we're worried about with sort of this data you is really a sort of a reputational you, and to what extent there's an overlap there, or if you see one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I haven't worked out all the kinks with that because I certainly think, I think data you intensifies the ability for that reputational you, or for you to have your likeness or otherwise be used in ways that you may or may not authorize, or your estate might not authorize, right? So it intensifies that tendency or that ability. So in that sense, it overlaps. But I think there's also elements of data use that aren't related to the public consumption necessarily. So what you're talking about with using, really famous faces, that's what really matters. But I guess every day, we could potentially all be used in ways, our data could be used in ways that we don't authorize. I think it has to do with more than, it goes beyond just your reputation in the world. And that's, I use the people's data after they're dead because I think it's one of these extreme examples that helps illustrate why this is a problem maybe for those of us who aren't dead yet, because it isn't just your reputation. I think it's also the potential for things to affect you going forward. So, there are lots of examples of people whose data from many years ago that they don't think is relevant, or maybe they don't think it's like, people whose criminal records have been expunged on one log, but then it turns out that the police never expunged their records. And then when they apply for tenancy, for example, both records show up and they end up having a criminal record, even though that criminal charge was expunged, stuff like that. I think it doesn't just hurt you reputationally, broadly speaking, it can also hurt you in ways that are that maybe not public, but certainly are effectively ways that you are able to access things or not. But yeah, I think that's a really good question. And in fact, in earlier iterations of this project, I had thought about the U in 3 different ways. I've since simplified it a little bit, but one of the U's was represented U. How is U being represented? We've always, put ourselves out there socially. So how does data affect that, right? So I think that's a great question. Thanks.
Great.
Thanks so much. Wendy, I have to say, I think what I find so really striking about the framing is just like that shifting of the prism of the data U, and is data U actually a site of dignity? I mean, I think that because I think I also really resist this idea, and a lot of what you talked about, put up there today, like the propertization of data, and the idea that there is just us, and then there's this data that we own, and that's proving such a problematic framing. But as I say, just so striking for me and fruitful to say, actually, there is a data me out there, and that we might need to think about that as an entity that is through that lens of what does it mean to treat data me in a dignified way. Because if I think about, say, like what's going on inside of our big tech companies, like they're when they're doing all those things to data me, like if you start thinking about through that lens, just find that really, really striking, really fruitful. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. And I mentioned that Karina Vold is going to be our speaker next week. Her topic is AI extenders, directly in line, the ethical and societal implications of humans cognitively extended by AI. So really looking forward to that. And thanks again, Wendy, for a wonderful talk. Thanks,
thanks to everybody. That was great.
Super. Thanks. Bye, everyone.